So Bitcoin. I think everybody wants to understand it better.
Uh-huh.
And today you and I are going to try to figure out why everybody's talking about it,
Yeah.
especially now.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic.
We've got this really interesting article about like these crazy market trends, and we're going to get into this presentation by Michael Saylor,
Okay.
who's the CEO of MicroStrategy,
Right.
and he is like a huge Bitcoin advocate.
Right.
So we're going to tackle some pretty big questions today. Like, are everyday investors like you and me,
Right.
are we actually smarter than these big institutional investors?
Interesting.
Is Bitcoin really this revolutionary new way to protect your wealth?
Mm-hmm.
And could we actually be on the brink of like a crypto renaissance?
Oh, wow. Some big questions there.
Yeah, so let's just dive right in.
Okay, sounds good.
So this article we have, it talks about this really strange trend, like these
Yeah.
Bitcoin shrimps, which are basically small investors who own less than one Bitcoin.
Got it.
They're buying it up like crazy,
Yeah.
even though the price is like skyrocketed in the past couple of months.
It's true.
It went from like $55,000 to almost $90,000.
Yeah. And meanwhile, the humpback whales, as they call them,
Uh-huh.
people who hold, more than 10,000 Bitcoin, they seem to be selling.
So little guys are buying while the big institutions are like cashing out.
It seems that way.
Huh. That's weird because usually you think of the big investors as being the smart money, right?
Right. You would think so.
Like they know something we don't.
Exactly.
But it almost feels like now it's the opposite.
It does make you wonder.
Like the average investor is seeing something that these institutions are missing.
Yeah. And this actually kind of ties into what Michael Saylor is saying
Okay.
in his presentation. His main point is that we're living in really tough economic times right now,
Yeah.
and that very few traditional assets can keep up with inflation.
Like stocks and bonds?
Yeah, he talks about stocks, bonds, real estate, you name it.
Hmm.
They all struggle to beat inflation over the long term.
Right. And he's got the data to back it up.
Yeah, he shows all this data, and then he contrasts it with Bitcoin's performance,
Okay.
which has had an annualized return of 60% over the last 4 years.
Wow.
So he's basically making the case that Bitcoin doesn't just match inflation.
Uh-huh.
It like blows right past it.
So he's not just talking about making money though, is he?
No, he's not.
He's saying that Bitcoin is like a whole different system
Mm-hmm.
that's actually safer than traditional finance.
Exactly. He says that Bitcoin has no counterparty risk.
What does that even mean?
So basically it means that with Bitcoin, you're not at the mercy of things like a company going bankrupt
Okay.
or a country changing its laws or even a bank failing.
Wow.
Because it's a decentralized system. It's
Yeah.
not controlled by these institutions that could make decisions that might impact your wealth.
It's just code.
Yeah, it's controlled by math and code.
So it's like he's saying we need to get back to the fundamentals.
Right, like what he was talking about with the academics at MIT.
Yeah, like focusing on first principles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Getting back to those core foundational truths.
Oh, yeah, I like that. So he's got this really interesting visual in his presentation.
Okay.
It's a chart that compares Bitcoin's Sharpe ratio to the S&P 500 over the past 5 years.
I've seen that chart.
And so the Sharpe ratio is basically a way to measure how much return you get for the risk you take.
Right. Risk versus reward.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Bitcoin's Sharpe ratio has been looking really good lately.
Much better than the stock market.
Yeah, so he's saying that Bitcoin is not only built on this really solid foundation,
Right.
but it's also a better investment than the stock market.
At least in terms of risk and reward.
Got it. So, okay, but Bitcoin is still pretty small compared to like the rest of the global market, right?
Well, that's true. He puts Bitcoin's market cap at around $1.8 trillion. Which sounds huge. I know.
Yeah, $1.8 trillion is a lot of money.
It is. But it's actually tiny compared to the total global asset value, which he estimates at around $900 trillion.
Wow, that is a mind-boggling number.
I know, it's hard to even comprehend. But here's his main point. Traditional assets, even if they seem big and stable, they're constantly being eroded by what he calls entropy.
Entropy.
Yeah, basically it's all the stuff that can eat away at your wealth over time.
Like what?
Things like taxes, regulations, political turmoil, natural disasters, even inflation itself.
It never ends.
It's like death by 1,000 cuts for your portfolio.
Yeah, I get it. So it's like he's comparing these traditional assets to like this old warehouse.
Yeah.
That's falling apart.
Right. He uses some really powerful images in his presentation to drive this point home.
Okay.
He shows this warehouse that represents all these physical assets that are just weighed down by logistics and
Yeah.
regulations. And then there's a bank building that symbolizes all the risks tied to the traditional banking system.
Hmm.
And he even shows a yacht and a piece of artwork and like the scales of justice, all these traditional assets that are vulnerable to these erosive forces.
Got it. And then he contrasts that with a picture of this like modern house on a piece of land.
Right.
Yeah.
It's this sleek, modern home that looks really secure and efficient.
Yeah. And the point he's making is that with Bitcoin, you own something that's solid and secure.
Exactly. It's not tied to all these other risky systems.
So he's calling Bitcoin digital capital.
Yeah.
And he's saying that it's designed to resist all these forces that just chip away at value over time. So he's basically saying that our whole idea of investing is wrong.
It is a pretty radical idea.
Like, he's not just talking about beating the market. He's talking about escaping the market's inherent risks altogether.
That's right.
That's a pretty big claim.
It is. And he actually argues that Bitcoin's a better choice in foreign investments, too.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, because it's not tied to any one country or economy.
Right.
It's global. It's digital.
Yeah.
So anybody with an internet connection can access it. And in a world where things feel like they're getting more and more unstable, politically and economically, that kind of independence is really appealing.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah.
So is he saying that we should like ditch all of our traditional investments and just go all in on Bitcoin?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, he does say that it's still a young asset and its price can be really volatile.
Yeah, for sure.
But he actually thinks that those price swings are part of what makes it so powerful.
Really?
Yeah, he uses the word volatility, but like in a good way. Like he's saying that the potential for big gains outweighs the risk if you're in it for the long haul.
I mean, I get it, but how do you actually manage that risk?
Yeah.
It sounds a little scary.
Well, that's what Saylor's company MicroStrategy is trying to figure out.
Okay.
They're not just buying Bitcoin and hoping for the best. They've been building a whole strategy around it.
Interesting.
So they're buying and holding for the long term, but they're also looking at things like using leverage to potentially boost their returns.
Okay.
And they're finding ways to actually generate income from their Bitcoin holdings.
Wow. So they're trying to create like a whole ecosystem around Bitcoin.
Exactly.
Make it more than just a speculative investment.
Right. It's really interesting to see how far it's come.
It is. I remember when people thought Bitcoin was like just this fringe idea.
Right.
And now these huge companies are building their entire strategies around it.
And Saylor thinks this is just the beginning.
Really?
Yeah, he laid out some specific things in his presentation that he thinks will happen that will basically signal the start of this crypto renaissance he keeps talking about.
Okay.
So one of those things is the repeal of something called SA 121.
SAB 121. I don't know what that is.
Yeah. So basically, it's this rule that makes banks really hesitant to hold Bitcoin.
Oh, okay.
It has to do with how they have to account for it on their balance sheets. And Saylor thinks that if they got rid of that rule, it would totally open the floodgates for banks to start offering Bitcoin services.
So that would be like huge.
It would be massive. It would make Bitcoin way more accessible to everyday people.
Yeah, totally. And what else?
He also thinks that we'll start seeing Bitcoin ETFs that are set up in a way that actually lets investors trade their ETF shares directly for Bitcoin.
Wait, so you're saying people could actually trade their ETF shares for real Bitcoin?
Exactly.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Why would that be so important, though?
Well, it would make the ETF market for Bitcoin a lot more efficient and transparent,
Okay.
which is something that big institutional investors really care about.
Right. So more clarity from regulators, more big institutions getting involved. It sounds like Saylor's betting on Bitcoin becoming like a core part of the financial system.
Exactly. And he even thinks we'll see options trading on Bitcoin ETFs.
Oh, wow.
Which would open up a whole new level of sophisticated trading for investors.
It's crazy to think that Bitcoin has gone from this like underground thing
I know.
to something that's being debated in Congress and on Wall Street.
It's been quite a journey, and Saylor thinks this is just the first chapter.
So what's the next chapter?
Well, he believes that Bitcoin could actually become more valuable and important than all those traditional assets we were talking about earlier.
Really? Even more valuable than gold?
He thinks so.
Wow. But he's not just talking about it, though, is he?
No MicroStrategy has basically gone all in on Bitcoin.
They have. And they're not the only ones, right?
Nope. He actually highlights in his presentation that even countries are starting to hold Bitcoin in their reserves.
Which countries?
Well, the UK, the USA, El Salvador, China, even Bhutan.
Wow. So it's not just like tech enthusiasts and libertarians who are interested anymore.
Definitely not. It seems like it's starting to gain some serious mainstream acceptance.
It does.
Yeah.
But even Saylor admits that there are risks,
Right. Oh, yeah, for sure. He even points out that MicroStrategy's own stock, which is now very tied to the price of Bitcoin, has been way more volatile than any stock in the S&P 500.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Bitcoin is still a pretty new asset, and the price can go up and down like crazy.
Yeah.
It's definitely not for everybody.
You got that right.
Yeah.
But Saylor argues that the potential for big gains makes the risk worth it, especially if you're investing for the long term.
Yeah, it really does feel like we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
We went from like these tiny shrimp investors
Yeah.
to these huge institutions, and from all this like global economic uncertainty to this idea of like a crypto renaissance.
It's a lot.
Yeah, and the idea that Bitcoin could actually like reshape the world as we know it.
It is a lot to absorb.
It is. So like, what does it all mean? What's the takeaway for the average person?
Well, I think that's the big question, right? Like, what does it all mean for us?
Exactly.
What happens if Saylor is right?
Like if Bitcoin really does become this dominant global force.
Yeah. What happens then? How does it change how we think about money? About who has the power? About what's really valuable?
Those are huge questions.
They are.
I don't even know if anybody has the answers yet.
I think you're right.
We're like in an uncharted territory here.
Totally. And nobody can predict the future.
No, but that's what makes it so exciting.
It does.
We're literally watching a new financial system being born.
And we have a chance to be a part of it.
Exactly. To
Yeah.
like help shape how it evolves.
Yeah.
What I think is really interesting is this idea that Bitcoin could give power back to individuals.
Right? Like if you can hold your wealth in a system that's secure and decentralized and out of reach of governments and corporations, that's a game changer.
Yeah, it could totally shift the balance of power
Yeah.
away from these big institutions and back towards individuals.
Yeah, but let's be realistic. There are risks too, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
There are always risks when you're dealing with something new, especially in the financial world.
Yeah, we talked about the volatility, the scams, and all the regulatory challenges that come with this technology.
Right. You always have to be cautious. Do your research, understand the risks, and never invest more than you can afford to lose.
Exactly. Never put all your eggs in one basket. And I think it's important to remember that we're only hearing one perspective here.
Right.
There are a lot of different opinions about Bitcoin.
Yeah. And it's important to do your own research.
And come to your own conclusions.
That's what's so great about these deep dives.
Yeah.
We're not telling you what to think. We're just presenting the information, the different sides of the story.
We want you, the listener, to decide for yourself what you believe. The future of Bitcoin, and maybe even the future of finance, is being written right now.
And we all have a chance to be part of it.
So keep exploring, everybody. Dig deeper into the article and Saylor's presentation.
Yeah, they're packed with details that we didn't have time to cover.
Form your own opinions, challenge your assumptions.
And don't be afraid to ask questions.
Because this conversation is just getting started, and we're all in this together.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Bitcoin. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.